I used to believe that family meant protection, a bond stronger than blood, stronger than money. Every decision I made, every sleepless night spent building my company, was for them. My dream wasn't just to succeed, it was to make sure we all had a better life. And for a while, it worked. The business grew faster than I ever imagined. $8 million worth of sacrifice, loyalty, and blind trust. But then, the smiles started to fade. The phone calls got shorter. And one afternoon, sitting in a boardroom I built from scratch, I heard the words that split my world apart. Words that came from the very people I would have died for. They told me it wasn't mine anymore. That my shares, my blood, my years had been reassigned. Just like that. At that moment, something inside me broke. But not in the way they expected. Because they didn't take everything. They only created someone they should have never betrayed. What happens when the people you love most push you to become their greatest threat? For most of my life, I believed hard work could fix anything. I wasn't born into wealth or connections. What I had was grit, the kind that comes from watching your parents struggle and promising yourself that one day, they'd never have to again. Every early morning and late night was for them. My family was my purpose, my reason, my everything. When I first started my business, it was nothing more than an idea scribbled on a napkin, a small spark in a tiny apartment with peeling paint and too much silence. I didn't have investors or mentors, just a secondhand laptop and a vision that refused to die. My parents thought it was a phase at first, something that would fade when the challenges came. But I pushed through, learning, failing, rebuilding, until, piece by piece, it began to grow. Within a few years, what started as late-night orders and coffee-stained notebooks turned into something real. Offices. Employees. A brand people trusted. I named the company after my mother. She cried when she saw the sign. I still remember that day. She hugged me and whispered, "You've made us proud." And in that moment, every sacrifice felt worth it. Money started flowing in. For the first time, we had more than enough. I paid off my parents' debts, bought them a house, and even hired my younger brother to manage operations. Family dinners turned into business meetings, laughter mixed with talk of profits and plans. I told myself it was perfect. I told myself we had made it. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a tension I couldn't name. My father became quieter during meetings. My brother started avoiding my calls. My mother, once my biggest cheerleader, began asking strange questions about ownership and shares. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just concern, that maybe they were overwhelmed by the success. Still, there were moments that lingered. Like the afternoon I walked into the office and saw my father sitting with an unfamiliar man, their voices low, their papers quickly turned face down when I entered. Or the time my brother joked that I was too attached to the company, as if my entire life's work was just another hobby. I wanted to believe it was nothing. After all, they were my family. I trusted them more than anyone else on earth. And maybe that was my first mistake, mistaking love for loyalty. Outside of work, I barely had a life anymore. My friends drifted away as my world shrank into meetings, deadlines, and constant responsibility. I told myself that loneliness was the price of success, that soon it would all settle, and we'd finally have time to just be a family again. Then, a small detail started gnawing at me, one I couldn't ignore. My access to certain company files was suddenly restricted. Technical update, my brother said with a shrug. The accountant I'd trusted for years stopped replying to my messages. And my parents, well, they had started spending more time with lawyers than with me. Still, I stayed quiet. Because in my heart, I refused to believe the people I built my world around were capable of betraying me. I kept showing up, smiling, pushing through. But deep down, I could feel it, that something was about to break. I remember one night in particular. I was sitting in my office long after everyone left, the glow of the city outside casting reflections on the glass walls. The building was silent except for the faint hum of the lights. I stared at the framed photo on my desk, me and my parents, taken the day we opened the first branch. We looked unstoppable, invincible. And yet, staring at that picture, I felt something I couldn't explain, a hollow, sinking feeling that whispered a truth I wasn't ready to face. Something was coming. Something that would change everything. The moment the facade cracked, it came in pieces small enough to dismiss. A changed password here, a cancelled meeting there, until the pieces began to fit together into a shape I could no longer ignore. At first I told myself it was stressful, that success warped everything and made people protect what they had in strange ways. But the blood in my veins knew the truth before my brain could name it. This was not protection. This was a quiet, deliberate taking. It started with the accountant. He had been with us from the beginning, a neutral face who handled numbers the way others handled recipes. His tone on the phone shifted, explanations grew vague. Then he stopped answering entirely. When I asked for a report one evening, my access was denied, not because of a technical glitch, but because someone had changed my permissions and rewritten the narrative of who belonged to what. The system logged the changes. The timestamps didn't lie. The changes were made while I was in meetings, while I was signing contracts, while I trusted my family to hold our home together. I spent nights combing through emails, receipts, and archived versions of documents. I learned to read the language of betrayal the way I once learned balance sheets: cold, factual, and devastating. There were transfers routed through shell entities, meeting minutes altered after the fact, and signatures that appeared where my name had once been. Names I trusted surfaced in places that made my stomach turn. My brother's initials on a board resolution, my father's signature notarized on a document that reassigned equity. Each discovery landed like a brick, and each brick built a wall between who I thought they were and who they had become. There was no dramatic confrontation. The betrayal unfolded in silence, in legalese and ledger entries. I felt like an intruder in my own life, walking through rooms that were suddenly foreign. My phone would ring with automated alerts about changes I had not authorized. Vendors sent notices to new accounts. The office felt colder. People I had hired because I believed in them avoided meeting my eyes. The world I had constructed with my hands was being redrawn in ink I did not sign. Anger arrived in waves. At first it was hot and immediate, the kind that made my hands clench and my vision blur. Then it settled into something slower and more useful, a steady burn that sharpened my focus. Crying came in the small hours, but it was brief. Grief had no time to take root because every hour demanded action. I stopped asking why and started asking how. How had they managed to execute this without my knowledge? How many people were involved? How long had the plan been in motion? The first concrete proof appeared like a breadcrumb left by someone careless. An old laptop that had been retired and put away contained a draft of a shareholder agreement with notes in the margins. The notes were not mine. They referenced meetings I had never been told about, and an alternate structure that redistributed shares under the guise of family protection. Protection for whom? I wondered, as my pulse quickened. The file metadata showed edits across months, and the editor's name matched the lawyer my parents had begun seeing. Finding that file felt like stepping onto a trapdoor. Once opened, everything else tumbled out. I found emails between my brother and the lawyer, planning the timing of announcements. I found a transfer receipt for a trust in my parents' names, funded on the same day a board vote had been registered. There were phone logs showing calls between the lawyer's office and a competitor. There was a pattern not random but intentional and methodical. Confrontation in any conventional sense was impossible. Words would have been futile. Instead, I cataloged, made copies, and taught myself how to preserve evidence without tipping my hand. Every document, every screenshot, every little anomaly was another rung on a ladder I was building, a ladder I intended to climb not to reconcile, but to reclaim. I hired a forensic accountant under the pretense of an external audit and watched, from the inside, as auditors began to ask the questions I could not yet voice publicly. I sat in the back of rooms where strategies were discussed and listened to the language of my own dispossession without letting anyone know I understood. There were moments that stung more than the cold arithmetic. The sight of my mother at the head of a meeting, smiling easily while decisions were signed, felt like a betrayal not only of law but of memory. The house I had bought them sat differently in my mind, no longer a safe harbor, but the headquarters of a conspiracy that had stolen my future. My brother's flippant comments about managing family assets landed like insults I could not afford to answer. They had turned filial duty into a weapon, and I was the target. Rumors began to leak in circles I could not control. Investors whispered about instability. Key partners asked probing questions. The media hadn't yet noticed, but the tremor had begun. My reputation, painstakingly built, wobbled under the strain of their maneuvers. People I had once relied on began to doubt the firm I had birthed. The attention was the kind I had once sought, but now it threatened to expose me as powerless. With each passing day, I realized that waiting would equal losing. Legal battles would be slow and would drain the resources I still had. Public exposure, without proof, would label me as bitter or unstable. There was a narrow corridor of options, and I had to choose the one that preserved both truth and momentum. It was not a path toward revenge born of malice, but a strategy carved from necessity. I would make them see the consequences of their choices in terms they could not ignore. So I began to move. Not with the reckless fury that had once inhabited me, but with precise, deliberate steps. I cultivated alliances in the margins. A former employee who had left disgruntled, a vendor owed money, an old client with grudges of their own. I fed the audit team selective leads that forced questions to be asked in the open. I leaked documents in a controlled fashion to journalists who were hungry for a story, but careful with sources. Each reveal was a test. How would they scramble? Who would act first? Who would crack? Sometimes I rehearsed little scenes in my head, imagining their faces when the truth unspooled. Other times I sat with anger, letting it harden into resolve. I learned to compartmentalize the personal pain from the professional mission. I reminded myself that this was not simply about money. It was about the principle that the work of my life could not be stolen and sold while I stood silent. But revenge is a dangerous teacher. It whispers that urgency excuses risk. It convinces you that the end justifies methods that would once have made you recoil. I watched myself teeter at the edge of choices I had vowed never to make. I had to craft boundaries, lines I would not cross, even as I prepared to push them in ways that would hurt the people who had hurt me. The deception had been thorough, but not perfect. A single slip, a rushed email, an unguarded comment, a bank transfer marked with an old account number, offered the next lever. I seized it. I used their own arrogance against them, baiting responses, documenting missteps, and turning their haste into traps. Each small victory fed the larger plan and, with it, a dangerous satisfaction that settled into my bones. As the pressure built, so did their paranoia. Meetings grew tenser, phone calls became guarded, and alliances frayed. I could sense the shift even from the periphery I had chosen. They were beginning to understand that someone was watching, and that someone had found a way to push back. For the first time since the papers were signed, I felt the balance begin to tilt. And then, just as I started to feel the taste of control, an unexpected letter arrived. Not in my inbox, but in a plain envelope slipped under my apartment door. It contained a single page, a fragment and a warning, the handwriting unfamiliar and hurried. The message inside made clear that my actions had been noticed and that the people I had trusted were willing to escalate. The air changed. The boardroom, the house, the office corridors, all of it felt like a stage set that could collapse at any moment. I stood at the edge of something enormous, a confrontation I could no longer avoid, a reckoning that would demand everything I had. The plan I had been crafting would either reveal the truth or destroy what remained of what we once called family. Was I ready for the damage that truth might cause? Would exposing them mean losing them forever? In law, in legacy, and in memory? The question pulsed like a time bomb, counting down to the moment I would have to choose between exposing the wound and letting it fester. And then I realized that I had already chosen, in the quiet of those sleepless nights, the line I would walk. The rest was about execution. The day it all came crashing down didn't look different at first. The sky was painfully ordinary, pale, cloudless, quiet, the kind that never warns you a storm is coming. But inside me, everything felt electric. I had spent weeks weaving threads of truth through the lies they built, and now, every secret they buried was about to surface. I wasn't nervous. I was beyond that. What I felt was clarity, the kind that comes right before destruction. That morning, I walked into the office, the same glass building I had once called my second home, carrying a folder that could burn the empire they'd stolen from me. Inside were contracts, transfers, emails, and recordings, everything tied neatly into one undeniable truth. They had betrayed their own blood. My family, my partners, my thieves. I had called an emergency board meeting under the pretense of finalizing a new investment. They didn't suspect anything, not yet. My father sat at the head of the table, calm and authoritative, like he always had. My mother's face carried that polished serenity she used to wear in church, and my brother scrolled through his phone, avoiding my gaze. For a moment, I almost faltered. They looked so familiar, the people who once shared my dreams, my laughter, my home. I could almost hear my younger self whispering, "Don't do this. They're your family." But then I remembered the empty bank account, the revoked shares, the cold signatures that erased my name from the company I built. And I remembered the letter, the one slipped under my door warning that if I didn't stop digging, accidents happen. So I didn't hesitate. I opened my folder and slid a single document across the table. "I think we need to talk about this." The room shifted instantly. My father leaned forward, confusion flickering into panic as he scanned the paper, a transfer of ownership dated months before I'd been informed. My mother's hand froze on the table. My brother stopped breathing for a second. "That's confidential," my father said finally, his voice steady but hollow. "So is fraud," I replied. I reached for the remote and pressed play on a recording I had queued up. The boardroom filled with their voices, familiar, distorted slightly by the recorder's distance. My brother's nervous laugh. My mother's calm instructions. My father's voice said, "She doesn't need to know yet. Once it's official, it's done." No one spoke. Outside, through the glass walls, the PR team was gathering. I'd made sure that. The meeting was being streamed internally to the company's senior staff. Every word they said, every paper on that table, was now visible to the people who once called me their founder. My father stood up, anger cracking through his composure. "You're destroying your own family," he said. "No," I answered quietly. "You already did that." He reached to shut off the screen, but I was faster. Another file opened. Emails between them and our rival company, negotiating a silent merger using my shares as leverage. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It was public, irreversible, and documented. My mother finally spoke. "You don't understand. We were protecting the family." I cut her off. "By stealing from it? By erasing me?" Her lips trembled, but no words followed. My brother's face had turned pale, his hands shaking under the table. I watched them crumble, the people who taught me to be strong, to build, to believe. And for a fleeting moment, I wished I didn't have to see it. But the truth demanded witnesses, and I'd made sure there were plenty. The silence that followed felt endless. Then, as if on cue, the company's legal advisor entered, the same man who'd once worked with them. Only this time, he carried a new document, one I had prepared with a different firm. It was a motion to nullify all unauthorized transfers and reinstate my ownership based on the fraud evidence presented. The board had been briefed in advance. The vote took less than 2 minutes. By the time it ended, my father had sunk back into his chair, staring at the table like it had betrayed him too. My brother stormed out. My mother tried to speak, but I couldn't listen. The building's security escorted them out quietly, avoiding the cameras that had begun to swarm outside. I should have felt triumphant. After all, I had won. My company, my name, my future, all restored in one decisive blow. But standing there, watching them walk away, I felt something colder than victory. Revenge isn't fire, it's ice. It doesn't burn you at once. It freezes you slowly, until you can't tell if you've destroyed them or yourself. When the reporters arrived, I said nothing. Let them write whatever story they wanted. The genius entrepreneur who outsmarted her family, the scandal that shook the company. It didn't matter. I had told my truth, and the world had listened. But behind the headlines, behind the corporate chaos, was the silence that no one could see. The silence of a daughter who realized that no amount of justice could fill the void her family left behind. That night, I went back to the house I'd bought for them. It was empty, the walls stripped of the laughter and warmth that once lived there. On the kitchen counter lay a note in my mother's handwriting. We only wanted to secure our future. I stared at it for a long time before setting it down. The house was mine now, legally and otherwise. But it didn't feel like home. Outside, city lights shimmered like broken glass. I thought about everything I had lost and everything I had taken back. Maybe this was justice. Maybe it was just survival. Either way, it was done. Or so I thought. Because as I turned off the lights and stepped toward the door, I noticed a red envelope tucked beneath it. Same color, same handwriting as the first one that had warned me. My chest tightened. Inside, a single line. You've won this round. But the game isn't over. I froze, the paper trembling in my hands. The war I thought I ended had just begun. When the dust finally settled, there was silence. Not the kind that soothes, but the kind that echoes, heavy and unrelenting. I remember standing there, surrounded by the aftermath of what I'd done. The faces that once haunted me were gone, the truth laid bare for everyone to see. My revenge was complete. And yet, I felt hollow. For months, maybe years, I had lived with one purpose: to make them pay. Every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, had been fuel for this fire. But once it burned everything down, I realized something I hadn't expected. I was standing in the ashes of the person I used to be. People congratulated me. They said I was brave, strong, and unstoppable. Some even called me a hero. But they didn't see the other side. The quiet moments when I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, asking myself if I'd gone too far. Because in my quest to destroy them, I'd become something unrecognizable, something darker. There's a strange kind of loneliness that comes after revenge. You spend so long fighting an enemy that when they're finally gone, you don't know who you are without them. I'd gotten used to anger as my heartbeat, bitterness as my breath. And now that it was over, the silence inside me was deafening. But even through the numbness, there was clarity. I had faced my monsters and won. Not because I broke them, but because I refused to let them define me anymore. My revenge wasn't just payback. It was a declaration. A line drawn in blood and truth that said, "You cannot destroy me." Still, victory didn't feel the way I thought it would. There was no triumph, no cinematic satisfaction. Just release. A quiet exhale after years of holding my breath. And maybe that's what real revenge is. Not the moment they fall, but the moment you finally let go. I saw their lives crumble in the same way they tried to shatter mine. I watched their lies unravel, their fake smiles collapse under the weight of exposure. For a while, it felt like justice. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw eyes that had seen too much, hands that had done too much. And I couldn't decide if I was proud or ashamed. It took me a long time to understand that revenge doesn't erase pain. It only mirrors it. You end up carrying pieces of the person you destroyed, whether you want to or not. It's like poison. It leaves your system slowly, and by the time you realize it's killing you, it's already deep inside. But I don't regret what I did. Not entirely. They needed to face the truth, and I needed to take back my power. The world doesn't always hand you justice. You have to carve it out yourself, even if your hands bleed in the process. Since then, I've rebuilt myself, piece by piece. I've learned to live without the constant hunger for revenge, without the need to prove I was right. Some days I still feel the sting of what happened, but now, instead of hatred, there's understanding. Because revenge taught me something no victory ever could, that sometimes the real battle isn't against others. It's against the parts of yourself that refuse to heal. When people hear my story, they always ask the same thing. Was it worth it? I never know how to answer. Because yes, I got justice. I exposed every lie, every betrayal. But I also lost something along the way. My innocence, my peace, maybe even a piece of my soul. And yet, I'd do it again. Not out of anger, but out of love for the person I was before they broke me. For the girl who deserved to be heard, believed, respected. She deserved justice. And I gave it to her. Now, when I walk past the places where it all began, I feel something shift inside me. The pain is still there, faint but familiar. But it doesn't control me anymore. I survived what was meant to destroy me, and in doing so, I became someone new. Maybe that's the irony of revenge. We chase it thinking it'll make us whole, when really, it breaks us open in ways we never imagined. But through those cracks, the truth shines. The truth that we're stronger than the people who hurt us. That even in our darkest moments, we can choose who we become next. So yes, I got my revenge. But more than that, I found my freedom. And now I ask you, if someone shattered your world, would you burn theirs to rebuild your own? Or would you find a way to rise without the fire? Because in the end, revenge doesn't decide who we are. We do.